Well, hello, everyone. This is Fadi, and I'd like to welcome you back to another special edition of our Let Us Reason program on Friday. With me here, our dear brother James Snapp Jr. And if you've been really tracking with us, you know that the focus of our discussion has been textual criticism. And last time, which is last week, we talked about the ending of Mark, which, as many of you know, that sometimes you come across a footnote in your Bible that says, some manuscripts, or some will say earlier manuscript, do not have this particular passage. But I believe my brother made a good case, a solid case, to show that really early on it's been identified as part of Mark. And today is no exception. We're going to talk about yet another topic that has to do with the pericope, or with the section that deals with the adulterous woman that was mentioned in the Gospel of John towards the end of John 7 and the beginning of John 8. And with that said, I want to welcome all of you, welcome our moderators, welcome those who are joining us right now. Thank you so much for taking the time to do so. And I want to just let you know that, believe it or not, that we have 3 platforms now instead of 2. So we are airing it at 3 different platforms, and I'm thankful for the technology that allows us to do this. With that said, brother, thank you as always for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So what is it about this particular section of the scripture that, first of all, made it, let's use the term, questionable in the mind of some scholars, especially New Testament Greek scholars, that they will tell you, for instance, that this may not have been part of the Gospel of John? And I came across a number of it because I've been preaching from John 8 for the last couple of weeks, and it saddens me when I come across these kind of comments as if they're discounting it, as if it doesn't count, basically.
Well, often the footnotes and comments that one sees in Bible footnotes and in some commentaries, they're phrased in a way that points the reader toward the conclusion that the passage is not authentic. And often the footnote will say things like this passage is not found in the earliest and most reliable manuscripts, and in the passages where in the manuscripts that it is found, it appears in different places. And these 2 factors tend to give an impression that it simply doesn't belong in the text. This is the impression that scholars such as Dan Wallace would promote. I think James White has also promoted that position, and would decline to preach from the passage on the grounds that it wasn't in the original text. And
with that said, brother, I mean, these are no mediocre scholars. I mean, we're not talking, especially when you say Dan Wallace. I mean, I had Dan Wallace in my office just a little over a year ago, and I enjoyed meeting him, and I enjoyed listening to his lecture at our church, and it was wonderful, really. But I mean, why would they take a route like this? What evidence do they have, and what evidence are we going to present today to kind of like counter the argument?
Well, in the field of New Testament textual criticism, one of the main books that still carries a lot of influence is Bruce Metzger's textual commentary on the Greek New Testament. And in fact, in many commentaries that don't say Bruce Metzger on the cover, but in many of their commentaries, when it comes to text critical questions, it doesn't take a lot of deductive skill to see that the author has simply picked up Bruce Metzger's textual commentary and found a different way to rephrase what Bruce Metzger said, sometimes almost exactly what Bruce Metzger says. And so that degree of dependence upon one source is, I think, it kind of contributes to what's called groupthink, where it's very hard to back up from that. It's the old saying about, you can't turn a battleship over just like that. It takes some time. And even with various discoveries that have been made in the past 100 years, things that were written more than 100 years ago still get repeated because people are still depending on the same books, which need to be updated. Unfortunately, that includes some statements that Dan Wallace has spread and promoted in some of his lectures.
So just before we even, I'll be remiss if I don't remind people, what is that passage starting in John 7:53, I believe?
Yes, it starts in John 7:53. It begins with the phrase, then everyone went to his own house, and then the scene reopens with Jesus teaching the people, and a group of religious leaders, they're in Jerusalem. The religious leaders come to Jesus, and they have this woman, and they tell Jesus, they put the woman down, and they said, Jesus, we have this woman, we caught her in the act of adultery, in the very act. Moses in the law says she ought to be stoned, but what do you say? And this is obviously a trap for Jesus, as it's often been explained. On the one hand, if he lets it go, they'll say, well, he's denying the law of Moses. He's clearly not to be followed. But then if he says, well, go ahead and stone her, then it goes in the opposite direction. You see he's not compassionate. And so I think even Bart Ehrman, who doesn't believe the passage is authentic, has recognized that this is the gist of what's being presented. And of course, Jesus sits down, acts at first like he doesn't hear them. He simply ignores them. They insist, and he says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And you can see how the scene has been spruced up quite a bit in some of the movies about Jesus' life. It's sometimes not really presented as it's presented in the text, but you can see that's the gist of what we see in the text. And one by one, the religious leaders are convicted by their consciences to not do anything. Nobody stones the woman, and Jesus says, "Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" And she says, "No one, no man, Lord." And Jesus says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." And then in the next verse, Jesus is speaking and says, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of light." The light of light.
Yeah.
So that's the passage from John 7:53 to 8:11, and then about the light of the world is in verse 12.
Right, exactly. So many times people will say, well, look, Jesus is saying, I am the light of the world. So he must be connecting it back to the festival that was dealing with light and water back in John 7, which, by the way, I read a number of commentaries, and it doesn't appear that there is a connection between him talking about the light of the world and that particular event. In fact, it appears that it has been a span of time between the two. So I'm not really so sure where their argument about why they think that particular passage about the adulterous woman is strange. All that to say, brother, so where do you want to take us from here?
Well, first it's important to realize to get an accurate picture of the evidence that we have, the external evidence. And because often it's said, well, that passage never shows up early on, or it's just in the later manuscripts that the King James is based on. The King James would tend to be based on later manuscripts, but those manuscripts themselves were mainly representative of a much larger group of manuscripts, which even Hort, who favored the Alexandrian text, Hort granted that this the Byzantine text was the dominant text back in the 400s. So it's not as if a later manuscript will have a later text. It's simply the material that it's written on is late. That doesn't make the text itself originate just out of the blue. So if we could look
at someone in here by the name of Darius says that none of the early church fathers made reference to this text or wrote commentaries on it, as indicating that it's a passage that they weren't aware of. So yes. I'm putting a buzz in your ear about what some of the comments are saying. So just
perhaps,
you can address this at some point.
Based on a comment that Dan Wallace made, or that Bruce, that is like a comment that Bruce Metzger made. I think he might be referring to the claim that Dan Wallace made. If you have a slide there of Wallace Fathers in his online lectures on textual criticism, Dan Wallace made.
Which slide do you want me to show? The one? Can you tell me the title?
Wallace Fathers, I think, is the title of it.
Okay, I will go there. Continue, please. No problem.
And the claim has gone out that none of the early church fathers comment on this passage. That's probably based on reading Metzger, like I mentioned earlier, where Metzger said that no early Greek patristic fathers mentioned the passage. Metzger's almost at the same time Metzger was writing those words, discoveries were being made that would collide with that. In the Syriac text of pseudo Zacharias Rhetor, there's the claim. He refers to a passage in a copy that was possessed by a bishop named Mira, and that is based that is in an echo of an earlier Greek source. Also in the writings of Didymus the Blind, which were just being discovered while Metzger was doing his commentary writing, Didymus makes a reference to a story of Jesus and a woman. So there are those two passages in Greek, are in Greek-based sources, that if Metzger were to go back to, if Metzger knew now, well, he's passed on, but if Metzger had known the evidence that is available today, he would have modified that statement. Unfortunately, like I said, the obsolete book from the past is still being picked up today and read like the discoveries that CIRA never happened, or like Pseudo Zacharias Rhetor just doesn't exist. So if we would,
from what year the references you're talking about right now, that if Metzger knew about him, what's their date?
This would have been back in the 60s, maybe early 70s when it comes to publication, but the discoveries were being made back then. But it was a while before it came to light and people realized what they had, and it takes a while to trickle down from a discovery in the field to making.
Sure. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls are an example of that. Yeah. Since their discovery, people are still publishing new things from them. So I understand. Keep going, brother. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's the basic situation that we still have. People are still reading Metzger's textual commentary and not taking into consideration the discoveries of the papyri at CIRA that had Didymus's commentary on it in it. They're not taking into consideration the copy that's reported to have been in Mira's or Mora's copy. So that's not quite accurate to say that no Greek fathers comment on the passage, but definitely the Wallace's comment was not qualified even to emphasize Greek. I think if you have, can you put that back up again? Metzger's statement was, I don't think there was anything about Greek fathers in the statement, but Wallace's statement was that no fathers in the first millennium mentioned the passage, and that is simply it. Well, yeah, he says you don't see any fathers of the first millennium. Really, that statement should be retracted because it is demonstrably false. We do have many church fathers quoting from this passage. They're quoting it from John. For instance, Ambrose. If we were to turn to the writings of Saint Ambrose of Milan, this is from the well into the first 1,000 years. This is like in the AD 380s. Ambrose quotes from the passage. Leo the Great. This is in the middle of the 400s. So this is not only from the first millennium, from the first half of the first millennium, but also Jerome. Now, of course, Jerome includes the story of the adulteress in the Vulgate text in 383. But later on in another composition, he mentions that he has seen the story of the adulteress in many copies, both Greek and Latin. And so here is Jerome's comment from about the year 417, and he testifies that he's seen this passage in many copies, both in Greek and Latin. Also, we see the passage referred to by Augustine. Augustine goes on about it quite a bit, and a book called Apologia David, which is probably by Ambrose, but the writer of Apologia David says perhaps when he's talking about the title of Psalm 51, he says perhaps most people are taken aback by the title of the psalm that you've heard read, that Nathan the prophet came to David after he had gone into Bathsheba. Likewise, those with weak faith could be disturbed by the gospel reading, which has been covered, in which we see an adulteress presented to Christ and sent away without condemnation.
Okay, so I'm gonna comment. This gentleman keeps insisting that we don't have any evidence earlier than 300 or 400 to prove its existence.
Well, I'll keep going. But D.A. Carson is another person, along with Dan Wallace, who has said all the earlier church fathers omit this narrative. And that's simply not true. When we look at the writings of Pacian of Barcelona, who became a bishop in about 365, in his epistle to Symphonian against the treatise of the Novatians, this is what Pacian writes. And again, this is about 365 is when he becomes a bishop. It says, if you don't receive the one who repents because you are without mercy, you shall sin against the Lord God, for you don't obey our Savior and our God, to do as he also did with her who had sinned, whom the elders set before him, and leaving the judgment in his hands departed. But he, the searcher of hearts, asked her and said to her, have the elders condemned thee, my daughter? She said to him, no, Lord. And he said to her, go your way, neither do I condemn thee. In him, therefore, our Savior and King and God is your pattern, O bishops. This is Pacian, Pacian, writing this letter, and obviously he's expecting people to know the text that he's talking about. So it is a well accepted text at the time of Pacian. Also, Ambrose and Ambrosiaster, Ambrosiaster, that's a kind of a nickname for this writer. We don't really know exactly who he was. But Ambrosiaster wrote in Against Novatian, they brought a prostitute to the Lord, and he spared her who had been apprehended in adultery. Also, I think you have a slide that says the Old Latin Capitula. And the Old Latin...
I'll go and check it. I'll go and check it for you right now.
The Old Latin Capitula are an interesting witness because they represent the chapter summaries that copyists like to present often before a text. This is something that would often appear before the actual text of a book began. There would be, just like we have in books today, list of the chapters, sometimes chapter titles. Well, in the old days, they would also summarize the chapter, and they would have a list of chapter summaries. And one of those list of chapter summaries survived even in later Vulgate copies, where a manuscript could have a Vulgate text, but it would still have the Old Latin supplements. And this was one of the supplements from the Old Latin, kind of echoing the days of yore. And in this manuscript, we see one of the Old Latin chapter summaries, which has been assigned to just after the time of Cyprian, which puts it very early, which would put it in the mid to late 200s. And in this Latin chapter summary, we see it just mentioned at the beginning, that Jesus dismissed the adulteress, and then he went on to talk about himself being the light of the world. So we have those Latin chapter summaries from, they're assigned to the 200s, which is very early when it comes to the average date of a New Testament witness, and that's and especially we consider that, well, if that's in the Old Latin, where did the Old Latin come from? And if you have Greek loanwords being in that text, as we see in Ambrose's use of the text, he quotes with words, with verbiage that seems to be based on an earlier Greek form of the text. So if it didn't just pop up in Latin, but came from a Greek source, then you have a Greek source earlier than the late 200s that has the passage in the text. That would be the implication of this evidence. So there's the Old Latin chapter summaries, and that's a very early source. Now, most of the manuscripts that don't have the passage tend to come from one particular transmission line, the Alexandrian text. We're basically looking at an important line, but also a relatively narrow line in the Alexandrian text. P66, P75, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex T. We also have Codex W, which is Alexandrian in this part. And so we see this. The Alexandrian text has the non-inclusion of the verse. That's not questioned. We also see in the Lycopolitan text of John, what's called the Qua Codex, which was published back in like 1924. It also does not have anything between John 7:52 and John 8:12. Now, when it comes to what do they have at the very end of John, that's an interesting question, because many of these witnesses aren't quite as intact as we would like them to be. They just due to incidental damage. It's not somebody was conspiring anything, but just due to incidental damage, they often we are not extant at the very end of John 21. But in those manuscripts, for instance, in Codex Vaticanus, some of the evidence points both ways. For instance, in Codex B, Vaticanus, very, very important manuscript, we don't have the text of the woman caught in adultery in John 7 and John 8. But at the very end of John, where there's just a naturally occurring blank space after the end of John, there in the margin, there are these two dots and these umlauts, also called distigmi. Now, I'm not convinced that these dots are ancient, but Dan Wallace has referred to the dots in another context as if he believes they are ancient. Well, if they're very ancient, then they are an ancient indication of a textual variant at that particular spot. And that particular spot in John, there at the end of John, that's where the representative manuscripts of Family 1 put the story of the woman caught in adultery. Now that will kind of transition to the why does it move around a little bit. But for the first thing to see, though, is that there are these dots in Vaticanus, which if these dots are ancient, then that would be an early indication of the presence of that text there at the end of John. And that would be a witness from the early 300s. Now, the Old Latin chapter summaries that I mentioned, those are assigned to a date before Vaticanus. So the idea that this is just late manuscripts is kind of ridiculous.
Well said.
We can take a look at some of the some of the manuscripts that are often cited for the non-inclusion of the story of the woman caught in adultery kind of point in both directions. It's been said, I think, that we only have 3 uncial majuscule manuscripts that support the passage. I think Dan Wallace has said something. See if you can find the slide that says a Wallace 3 majuscule manuscripts. This is another claim that is very widely distributed.
If you can give me 1 second, this gentleman is still insisting on arguing, and my grace is starting to reach its end right now. So I'm going to share with you what he's saying. In fact, I'm going to put it right here in front of you. Here's what he's saying. And by the way, this guy works in security. He doesn't seem to be very secure to me, but he works in business of security. So go ahead.
Yes, the story's not very well. 9th century is pretty good, but you can look in Codex F and Codex K, but also in some of the manuscripts you also have what's called memorial space. And if you have the slide that says, well, I don't want to get too far in that direction. Let's focus on what Wallace says about 3 majuscule manuscripts first. Well, there's this claim that it's 3 versus 300, and I think this claim has unfortunately been spread online by individuals other than Dan Wallace quite recently. In real life, when we look at the uncial manuscripts, if we set aside, not that we should, but if we did set aside the minuscule manuscripts and just look at the uncials, we don't really see the lopsided equation that Dan Wallace and some others tend to present in their online statements. There's this claim by Dan Wallace about 3 majuscule manuscripts. I think I have that on a slide here.
What is it called?
Wallace 3 majuscule manuscripts.
Okay, I will bring it to you right now. So keep going, brother.
I'll just pause for a drink. But yeah, when the uncials are examined, we need to remember that not all uncials are copies of the Gospel of John. Most of them have nothing to do with the text at hand because they're the text from someplace else. They might be a fragment that might be important for the particular passage that it testifies to, but it can't really say anything about a passage for which it's not extant. And here's Dan Wallace stating, we have 3 majuscule manuscripts out of the 322 that we have that actually have this passage. That's it. Now, of course, if it was really realistic to have that kind of lopsided equation, you can see how easily it would be to reject the passage. If you're going to say, well, we have 322 manuscripts that are for it, and only 3 manuscripts are against it as far as the magical manuscripts go. But in real life, that 322 is a fake number. That's the number of uncials we have. It's not the number of uncials of John that we have. It's not the number of uncials of John 7 and 8 that we have. So that kind of claim tends to mislead. Not that there's an intent to mislead, but it does tend to mislead when people just see those numbers like that. In real life, it's a much closer count, and it's not an exact count of 4 or against, because in addition to the manuscripts that either have it or don't have it, you also have some manuscripts that kind of point in both directions. Manuscripts like Codex L. I think you have a slide there of Codex L memorial space.
Okay, brother, I'll get.
Codex L is an important manuscript. It's a Gospels manuscript. It's a fairly early, about 700s, I believe, and it's notable for several readings, more in Mark, Luke, and John than in Matthew. But in Codex L, at this point in John, it has what's called memorial space, where it doesn't have the story of the woman caught in adultery, but what it does have is very interesting. It's this blank space from the end of John 7:52. There's this blank space, and then on the next page, after this extensive blank space, John 8:12 begins. So if a person like James White just mentions L as a witness for the non-inclusion of this passage, well, that's true, but it's certainly not the whole truth, because clearly the copyist has recollected the passage, and he's thinking, something's missing here. I remember there being something here. It's not in my master copy, but I remember something being here. And there's this memorial space that's not necessarily set down there, exactly calculated so that somebody can put it in. It's not that big, but it's clearly enough so that a person can see it and remember that there's something missing here. Also, we have a Codex Delta, another manuscript. And if we see Codex Delta, we can see the same general kind of treatment in Codex Delta, which when you look at it, it's a very different kind of manuscript. It's not written in the same school. The lettering is different. It's from a completely different setting. But in Codex Delta as well, when the copyist came to the story of the woman caught in adultery, Codex Delta Memorial Space is the name of his life. We see him doing the same sort of thing that we saw the copyist doing in Codex L. In Codex Delta, this Greek and Latin manuscript, we see also a blank space where we would expect to see in many other manuscripts this passage occur.
Is this the one that you just sent recently?
Yes.
Before the show?
Yep.
Okay, I'll go and find it then. No problem.
In Codex Delta, we see this blank space, and I think we'll see some of the details. But that's the main thing to see, that we have not just one, but 2 of these manuscripts, two uncial manuscripts, do testify to the non-inclusion of the passage, but also signify the memory of the copyist remembering some earlier manuscript in which the passage was present. And so when we come to, we can say manuscripts that have it, manuscripts that don't, but there's also a good number of manuscripts that are, in between. Here we see Codex Delta, the 2 pages from Codex Delta. There's not the passage, but clearly it's recognized that there was something here that I recall, but it's not in my master copy. But it was in another copy that was not available when he was making this copy. So there we see the memorial space for John 7:53 through 8:11 in Codex Delta. We see that in L. We see that in Delta. So these are copies that should be recognized, but the testimony shouldn't be tilted or just say no. It shouldn't simply be said that they don't have it, because there's more to the picture. So that's something that should be understood. And then also there are manuscripts such as Codex K, Codex Cyprius. And if we look at Codex K, we see the entire passage included in the text. This is an important uncial manuscript, Codex K. I think we have that here. And you can see Codex K that I've kind of marked so you can see where the exactly the verses are. In Codex K, Codex Cyprius.
for some reason, I cannot find Codex K. Is that also you send it separately? There is Codex L.
Mm-hmm. It might have been sent separately. I think I sent three batches, so they would all fit.
Okay. All right. Very good. I'll find it. No problem. Just keep talking.
Let me know when we get to that. There's also a Codex F, and Codex F is a damaged manuscript after it was discovered. It was not well treated. But in Codex F, we have just a little bit of the last bit of the story of the woman caught in adultery. John 8 10 through 11, and we also have this claim that we don't often see the passage in lectionaries, and with when it comes to lectionaries, that's where we see the mechanism that I believe started the whole difficulty. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. Here's Codex Cyprius, and in Codex Cyprius we see it clearly included in the text. There on that first page, it starts on the last line with 753. And goes on to include the entire passage there on the second page, and it concludes on the third page. Now, in lectionaries, it's often said that this passage is not in many lectionaries, and that is true. But what is also true, and here we need to get there's more to the story. In lectionaries, the Pentecost lection for the church began at John 7:37. Went to John 7:52, and then included John 8:12. Now, so you have in between. You find in many manuscripts you'll see these little marks in the margin that designate the beginning of lections, beginning of readings they would read annually in the church. And a second, and we can see that it was well known that in the Pentecostal lection that it would stop at John 7:52, but then pick up and conclude with chapter 8, verse 12. What I think happened is that in the early church, very early church, before there were lectionaries, when there were just lection cycles, there weren't books where you could find the readings themselves in order for the year. You simply had your copy of the Gospels that you would just understand that on certain days of the year, would be the passage you would read. Just like today, when we have Christmas time readings, you usually would read from Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke chapter 2. But at Pentecost, in the Byzantine lectionary, the lection to be read that day is John 7:37 through 7:52, and did I say Luke or John? Anyway, yeah, John 7:37 through 52 and John 8:12. Well, picture a copyist who's a professional copyist. He's not used to attending church on Pentecost, or he doesn't remember what he heard. But picture a copyist, a professional copyist, and a very, very meticulous copyist, one who wants to follow orders and do a good job. He gets a copy of John, and he's assigned to copy this book. And so he begins to copy the text of John. And when he gets to the Pentecost lection, he begins to copy that. But then he gets to John 7:52. I think I explained this a little bit before. He gets to John 7:52, and he sees this mark in the margin that says "jump down." This is a mark called the hyperbole mark. It's easily found in hundreds of manuscripts today at this particular point. He sees this mark that says "no, jump down." What's he do? Being an obedient, meticulous scribe, he jumps down, and he sees the word "resume" here at John 8:12. Now, what he's reading are not marks that were meant for him. Those marks are meant for the lector who's reading the Pentecost lection year by year. He's supposed to jump down from that point down to the beginning of chapter 8, verse 12. But the copyist does not know that. And so he thinks that the marks are meant for him. And so from John 7:52, he sees his instructions in the margin that say jump down. He sees the note that says resume here at John chapter 8, verse 12. And so that's exactly what he does. And thus the passage disappears in that particular transmission line. Depending on how many copies this copyist proceeds to make, that becomes very influential in the Alexandrian transmission line and in text influenced by that line. The passage simply disappears. We also see in family 1, and here we see the passage be moved. By the time we see family 1, this is just a small cluster of manuscripts, but they're mentioned sometimes in Bible footnotes where it says in some manuscripts we see this passage after John 21:25. So that's talking about the family 1 manuscripts. These are related not just by where they put this passage, but also by many other readings as well. It's a distinct form of the text. It says the Caesarean text. And we see in family 1 a note that comes before the passage. And the note says, we didn't, and there again, here, it's important to see the whole picture, because if you just say some manuscripts move the passage to after John 21:25, well, if you don't mention the note, it's going to mislead people. They're going to think, oh, it's just a butterfly floating around. It's often described that way, I think, by various commentators. The passage was a floating butterfly, a passage looking for a place to land. That's how it's often depicted. But when you realize the note is there, and when you don't hide the note from people, but tell them what it says, the picture, it becomes very different. In the note in family 1, the note says something to the effect of, and see my book for exact details, but the note says, we didn't find this chapter about the adulteress in most of the manuscripts. And it's not commented on by our cherished sacred fathers. So we put it here from where we had found it earlier in John, where they talk about how no prophets shall arise from Galilee, which is a reference to John 7:52. So in the family 1 note, it's not as if it was floating around somewhere. The note says explicitly where they found it. They found it in the Gospel of John after John 7:52, or in their language at the 8060 Sebean canon, but that's the same thing as John 7:52. So they see. So when you see the note, it's clear that the note got to, the passage got to John 21:25 from John 7:53. So it's important to not hide that note from people, because when that is done, they don't see the whole picture, and the picture they do see is a misleading one. That the floating butterfly theory, that there's really no basis for that theory in the text. It's never really, when you look into the details, a floating text. We see it where we see it anywhere but John 7:53 through 8:11. We see that it's come from there. Also, it's sometimes claimed, I think James White makes this claim, and in the Christian Standard Bible's footnote, the claim is made that in other manuscripts, the story of the woman caught in adultery comes after John 7:44. It should be important. It's important to realize these witnesses are not Greek manuscripts. If you read that note in the CSB, the footnote makes it seem like the Greek manuscripts. That's the natural impression that anybody will get, but they're not. It's Georgian manuscripts, and this reflects a time in the Middle Ages when the Georgian version was revised. The Georgian version was translated from the Armenian version, and the Armenian version is textually like family 1 in the Gospels. And so it's not a surprise to see in the Armenian version the story of the woman caught in adultery at the end of John. But somebody, when they come to revise it, making it more like the Greek manuscripts, they say, well, we need to put this back in the text, because they want to conform their Georgian text to what is the dominant Greek text. And when I say dominant, when it comes to the number of, simply in terms of number, just to gauge the dominance of it, besides being in the Vulgate text, which is hugely dominant, the story of the woman caught in adultery is absent from 270 manuscripts, but it is present in 1,500 manuscripts. So it's about 85%, which I would say is fairly dominant. And so the Georgian reviser of the text, now I don't read Georgian, so this is a little bit speculative, but not much, I don't think. Basically sees the F1 formatting of the passage and says, let's put it back there in the text in John that mentions at this point at the 8060 Sebean canon, but instead of going back to that exact point, he understands it to refer to John 7:44. So that's the Georgian check. That's simply a side effect of the Georgian revision in the Middle Ages. It's a branch from Family 1. So once again, we see go to 744 from the end of John, but from the end of John before that, as the note in F1 says, at John 7:52. So this doesn't mean what a person might naturally think the note means when you have these extra details that are not usually provided. Sometimes it is also said that in Family 13, it is not even found in John, but after Luke 21:38. And this is a later, much later effect of the lection cycle, but it doesn't have to deal with the main lectionary, the one that starts on Easter, the Synaxarion, but in what was called the Menologion, the set fixed feast days, where it's this day of the year, here's who we celebrate, here's who we honor on this particular day. In Family 13, there are some lectionary related adaptations. For instance, Luke 22:43-44 shows up in Matthew in Family 13. So this isn't the only passage that Family 13 shows lectionary based adaptations on, where all that has happened is that the copyist has said, this is going to be a manuscript that's going to be used for reading in church. We're going to make the lector's job easy rather than hard. So what do we do with the story of the woman caught in adultery? Do we keep it in the back of John? No, how's it going to find it there? Well, that makes the lector's job easier on Pentecost to have it there in the John. But what about other days? What about St. Pelagia's day? And I think you have the Argos Pelagia slide. I think we have that slide, and that shows
yeah, I'll get it. I'll get it right now. I just want to first of all thank you, Renee, for your super chat. And Renee has a question here. She's saying, how many of the 270 manuscripts where the passage is absent from are from the same line of transmission? Maybe she meant the same family.
Well, most of them will be from the Byzantine text, but you also have Codex Beza, which is way different from the Byzantine text, and it has it there in John at 7:53, and Beza probably comes from the 400s, so it's a fairly early manuscript. I think Ehrman called it one of our earliest copies, and but it's mostly the Byzantine text. Also, some of the Caesarean have it, but really that's another way to say it's the medieval manuscripts. Most of them are going to be Byzantine manuscripts, but when you get earlier than that's the time to find the different branches. Most of the Byzantine text is dominated by it, but within the Byzantine text, now that you bring it up, I don't want to go into this detour too long, but in the Byzantine text there are variations. In fact, if you take in hand the Robinson Pierpont Byzantine text form and look at this passage, you'll see that there are various readings in it. And if you were to take Swanson's horizontal line comparisons of manuscripts, you'll also find readings in that. So there are definite variations in this. And if you were to say, well, it always appears in the same form, then a person could say, well, that shows how late it is. It was just put in there clunk, and it's recent. Therefore, scribes haven't had time to change it or anything, or reflect local variations. But we don't see that. We do see distinct forms or subforms within the Byzantine text.
Right. Very good. Yeah. Thank you. I was going to say thank you, Renee, for the question, and also thank you, Veronica, for your super chat. So keep going, brother. You wanted me to find which one you said the image?
Argos Pelagia.
Okay. Pelagia. Very good. Very good. I'll find it for you right now. Go ahead.
Saint Pelagia was a saint who was famous enough to get her own day in the election cycles, and her day was I believe October the 8th, right after Sergius and Bacchus. Here we have a copy of the Argos lectionary, which is probably from the 800s or 900s, and if you look closely there, you can see that for October the 8th, that was her designated day. Was if you see that H there, that's actually the Greek number 8. And her date, I think you can zoom in and see her name right there. It's for Pelagia. Pelagia's lection was John 8:3 through 11. And in some manuscripts, you'll see John 8:3 through 11 has asterisk beside it. That's not saying we don't know about this passage, we're not sure about it. That's a claim that you will often see circulated that says this passage is shown to be spurious by these asterisks that accompany it. What you have is the person making the lection, the person making the manuscript, making sure that the person doing the reading on Pentecost is not going to read the Pentecost lection and blend it right into the lection for St. Pelagia's Day. So he marks the lection for St. Pelagia's Day with asterisk to say, no, don't read this part on Pentecost. This is the reading for St. Pelagia. And speaking of St. Pelagia's Day, you will often see...
what you're saying, if I want to clarify, you're saying there is a practice to do this. We have a precedence for that.
Yes, and in this case, you can go back and see in the... it doesn't happen very often, but in the Pentecost lection, we have this break, and that's where the lection for St. Pelagia's Day is. John 8, John 8:3 through 11 is the reading for St. Pelagia's Day. That was not to be read on Pentecost. That was part of what was skipped. But instead of leaving it up to the lector to know to do that, the asterisk ensure that he does so. Now, sometimes for the exact form of how the Pentecost lection would go, in some manuscripts, I think Codex Lambda does this. It extends all the way to chapter 8, verse 2, and then comes the jump to chapter 8, verse 12. So there were two at least two. There were probably more if you go into the details. But there were different variations in exactly how much of those verses inside the story of the woman caught in adultery would be read, because the woman herself doesn't appear until a little later after the section is introduced. But we see there in the Argos lectionary and in lots of other lectionaries, we see the passage John 8:3 through 11 is the reading for St. Pelagia's Day on October the 8th. Now that's significant when it comes to interpreting the evidence from Family 13. Family 13 is a particular small cluster of manuscripts that show signs of being influenced by the liturgy, by the lection cycle. And earlier in Luke 21, you have the reading for Saints Sergius and Bacchus. When was their day? September the 7th. And so you see the day for Sergius and Bacchus, that their reading happens in Luke 21. So it would be natural to put the reading for St. Pelagia instead of, if it's going to be at the end of, from the end of John, you're just making the lector's job easier by putting it there at the end of Luke 21. That's what we have in Family 13. It's not just floating around. It's put there on purpose. And when you look closely at its details, you can see how the text there in Family 13 has been slightly modified, so you can practically see where this was sewn on in Luke 21 in that particular cluster of manuscripts. It's not just floating around out there. It's
yeah. So we have a question. Maybe you addressed it already. Veronica here is she saying, is there or are there text inherent arguments for the legitimacy of the passage?
You'll have to define that term text inherent for me.
Say that again.
Can you define text inherent? I'm not familiar with
right. Yeah. So Veronica, if you can clarify your question, we'll be glad to address it for you. Keep going, brother. In fact, let me make a quick comment here. I've been preaching from John for the last few months now, and we're taking it systematically, chapter by chapter, pericope per pericope, passage by passage. And when you look at the theme, just thematically speaking, for instance, in John chapter 6, we have the theme of the wilderness and the manna. You get to John chapter 7, and we're talking about the water, basically also that was dealt with in the wilderness. You get to John chapter 8, you have the light, also dealt with in the wilderness. But also in this particular passage, brother, when the Lord kneeled down and start writing, it's kind of an interesting thing, because many also will say this could be a reference to the Ten Commandments and the tablets when God wrote with his own finger. I mean, so the theme is consistent, if you wish.
Yeah, I think Jerome, in one of his comments, he kind of chimes in on that theme, and he mentions the writing in the sand. And when it comes to themes, lots of things can be posited. I think Gordon Fee has this theory. I think you alluded to it earlier, where Jesus says he's the light of the world because there's this complex ceremony going on in the background, and so it ties in well with that theme. But in the text of John, we really don't see anything about that ceremony. We don't see anything about the pouring out of waters and so forth. Rather, the focus is on Christ. And so instead of instead of complimenting the goings on at the temple, it could be argued that Jesus is pointing out he is greater than the temple. He is the light of the world, in contrast to those things. So instead of saying that he is the fulfillment of this stuff that's going on, you can say that he is the real light of the world, as opposed to the lights that are being lit there in the temple. Also, when it comes to the timing of this event, this encounter, it's sometimes said that, well, the passage interrupts the narrative. Well, there's a record of an interruption, because every time somebody goes to bed, there's an interruption. But the statement that there was a statement in the text, no, then everybody went home. First of all, it's important to see it seems extremely unlikely that this would be a floating narrative that begins with the story with the words, and then everybody went home. I think Maurice Robinson has made that point very effectively. Now, how many stories begin with, once upon a time, everybody went home? So the idea it was a floating narrative, I don't think is plausible when it comes to that intrinsic evidence. And perhaps when I say intrinsic, that's the kind of text inherent evidence that was referred to earlier. So when it comes to intrinsic evidence, the placement of the passage is very natural, because we see right before this, the religious leaders are off by themselves. They're having their own little conference. The guards arrive and they say, "Where's Jesus? You haven't brought him?" The guards say, "Nobody ever spoke like this man." And so they're having their own conversation. Now, with the story of the woman caught in adultery, you have a perfectly good reason for the narrative to wrap up and resume the next day, because it says so quite plainly. That's what happens. But without that, if you're going to assume that it's just the same event, the same scene, at some point the Pharisees go from being in their own conference to being there with Jesus, because in chapter 8, verses 12 through 13, Jesus and the Pharisees are having this conversation. Where was the movement? How did the Pharisees get from being in their own private conversation to being back with Jesus? So when it comes to intrinsic evidence, I would say that's a stronger case that can be made that the story of the woman caught in adultery belongs there to necessitate that transition. Otherwise, without it, there's no transition in the text.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a gap of time, actually, when you look at starting in 8:12, it appears that there has been a gap in time between the events of chapter 7 at the festival and the encounter now that dealing with the light of the world. Now, I think Veronica's question, if I understood it correctly, she did rewrite it again. And Veronica, it's still a little bit complex for me what you're trying to get to. I think what you're trying to say is that, is there any evidence from Jesus's teaching that can allude to something like this? And I would say, comfortably, Jesus taught about the forgiveness of sin. The passage confirms that Jesus basically fulfilled the requirements of the law and that we are all sinners and so on and so forth. I mean, that will be the easy way to respond to this.
So I got in the chat and lost track of the question. Can you say that again?
I mean, she was just saying, are there any teachings by Christ that kind of like confirm what happened in this passage? And I'm saying, of course there is. I mean, the whole gospel and the whole New Testament, not necessarily the whole Bible, of course, indicate that Jesus' mission is to forgive sin, that we are all sinners in need of him, basically. Unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. And the idea that he is also fulfilled the law and its requirement. I mean, all of that, you find it there in his teaching.
Yeah, yes, I think that even some scholars who reject the passage as part of the original text of John have said that this passage is consonant with the teachings and the example of Jesus. Many of them had said, well, this is an excellent example of how Jesus operated. When he was being opposed, he would he just out-trick the tricksters and illustrate his mercy. When we see the woman, and you can add on the trappings that you see in the movies, and some later expansions of the story we see in the Armenian text. And this was kind of getting into some of the fine details that are brought out in more detail in my book. But there was probably a story that was very similar to this, by Papias, of Papias, in his book about the expositions of the Lord. He probably had a similar story. And later on, after this passage was lost, people said, "Well, we know that something belongs here." It was the same event that we saw in the story that Papias told, and so we can see this other story influencing the text of this story, and that's one reason why there are more variants in this passage. Not a lot more. That claim is exaggerated by some folks, but that is one factor that's in the picture. That there's this was a very popular story, and in fact, I believe in one of the early church writers from the 300s says the story of the woman caught in adultery is very famous. So it's not like this was some obscure oral tradition out there. We see oral traditions. Some of them eventually get written down, like the story of Abgar, but we don't see anybody trying to make of those oral traditions more than they are. Or if they do, for instance, in Codex Bezae, if they do, it's just a brief snippet here or there. So
go
ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Finish your thought, because we have a question. I want to put it in front of you right now from one of our friends. His name is Jai, and he's one of the moderators as well. And he's asking an excellent question here related to this.
Okay. So we see notes about this passage also sometimes. If you have the slide of GA 1187.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a flavor of Jai's question. We'll get back to it in a second. And where do you want me to go again? You said which image?
GA 1187.
Okay, we'll go there.
But I think he asked about P66 and P75. I would say that both P66 and P75, but especially P75, are examples of the Alexandrian transmission stream. So it's by the time they're made, the loss has been achieved in the Alexandrian transmission line. This is a medieval manuscript called 1187. You can see there at the top pertaining to the adulteress is the title of this chapter or this episode, this section, and you can see the little obeli alongside the passage. But down there at the bottom, there's a little note that appears in other manuscripts as well. So it's not like some scribe is simultaneously composing the note. The note is being copied from an earlier source, a katina. And the note, can you maybe zoom in on that a little bit? Well, the note says something to the effect of the Abelized passage is not commented on by our favorite commentators. It's not in the manuscripts of Apollonius. I think I got the name right. Check my book for reference. But it says this passage was confirmed by the apostles for the use of the church, and that's a reference to the what some folks thought was a book by the apostles. It wasn't really, but it's a book called Apostolic Constitutions, which is from about the year 380. And in Apostolic Constitutions is another reference to this encounter between Jesus and the adulteress. So that note is one example of how the passage would sometimes be enhanced or reinforced with notes like this one. So 1187 has it. 1424 also has that note. And also, there's one other variant that comes into play. If you have a GA 1333 Pelagia election, GA 1333.
Let me just make a correction. Mariana, it is actually John chapter 7:53 to John 8:11. Which one want to go to? And we need to start thinking about wrapping it up, everyone. So if you have any questions, please begin to ask us. I'm sorry, brother. Image again.
GA 1333, the Pelagia election. It's sometimes claimed that the story of the woman caught in adultery was floating around out there and landed between John and Luke. Between Luke and John. I think James White has given this impression, along with some others. I don't have Dan Wallace's statement on hand, but I think it should be looked at closely just in case. GA 1333, the Pelagia election. Here's the page in reference. This was once a blank space between the end of Luke and the beginning of John, but somebody came to copy 1333. As they were reading along, they realized the story of the woman caught in adultery was not initially in this manuscript, but they wanted it to be there. So they, instead of writing in the margin on that page in John, they went back to the beginning of John where there was this nice unused blank space, and that's where they put it. But it's not the entire passage. If you look into the details, and if you could just zoom in on the top of that page, you'll see them. Is there a way to zoom in? Can you zoom in on that?
Let me try.
Just use the magnifying glass. It should come out. But what you're seeing here is John 8:3-11. As I said, that's the lection for Pelagia's day. Yeah, there we go. And you can see it written right there on the page. This is the reading for the 8th of October for Pelagia. That's what that little title says. But more importantly, this title here says, from the Gospel of John. So this wasn't floating around out there. This is a lection that somebody's been reading from the Gospel of John. This is from a lectionary that had the reading for St. Pelagia's Day, and they put it in this manuscript. So this is not evidence of the passage floating around anywhere. This is evidence of the passage being accepted into the church's text that was regularly read on St. Pelagia's Day, October the 8th. That's what we have here in manuscript 1333. So when somebody says, oh, the passage was just floating around, sometimes it landed at the end of Luke. No, that is not the case at all. What we have here is the passage being put on a blank page of a manuscript. And it's not the whole passage, it's the reading for St. Pelagia's Days, as you can plainly see by looking at the top of the page. So that needs to be cleared up. If somebody's planning on making a Bible out there that has that in a footnote, please don't. So
yeah.
There's some idea of how much misinformation there is about the passage. We see from
it saddens me, brother, why we have scholars that sometimes just for the sake of writing a paper or getting a degree or doing postdoctoral stuff, they get into things like this and they have to come up with their own opinion as if they are the authority sometimes. And sadly, it influences the masses when they look up to the scholar and they ignore the word of God and its authority. That's just my view.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that so many inaccurate statements or so many incomplete statements have been allowed to dominate so many books. This book has many children, and so when you look at that book by Metzger and you're reading along in the commentary and get confused, I wait a minute, I can't tell which book I'm reading. Am I reading Metzger's comments from 50 years ago? Am I reading something that is informed by what's been discovered in the past 50 years? It's not that scholars are lazy, but sometimes they take things for granted that really should be tested. Back in the 1800s, John Bergen, when somebody said, Dean Bergen, can you give me any advice? He said, yes, check your references. And I think a lot of people today need to check their references when it comes to what they say about this particular passage and some other passages.
Indeed, brother. So any last thing you want to do or discuss to wrap up the topic? Are there any other images you would like to show?
If we can just go on to the questions and answer sessions, I'll be happy to take questions.
I think I've been asking them as we are going. Folks, if you have any other questions related to this, please send them our way. So, I mean, can you give just a summary then about what is the earliest that we have? What is the strongest evidence based on what we discussed that support its inclusion in the Gospel of John? If you can just do that real quickly right now as a summary.
In the Didascalia Apostolorum, that's a Syriac text, probably from the 200s. It's stated, if you don't receive the one who repents because you are without mercy, you shall sin against the Lord God. If you do not obey our Savior and our God to do as he also did with her that had sinned, whom the elders set before him, and leaving the judgment in his hands, departed. But he, the searcher of hearts, asked her and said to her, have the elders condemned thee, my daughter? She said to him, no, Lord. And he said to her, go your way, neither do I condemn thee. In him, therefore, our Savior and King and God is your pattern, O bishops. So we see the passage being used with authority in the 200s. And
that's right.
It's not an exact quote, but it's the kind of, if you've ever heard a preacher rephrase a scene, that's the kind of thing that we see here. We also see the passage being used in the Apostolic Constitutions in the year 380. We also see it in the Old Latin chapter summaries, which are assigned to the 200s. And Jerome says explicitly, although somehow this comment of his has escaped the people who made the NET Bible in their notes, they don't mention this. That's some of the, you're only seeing part of the picture problem that I mentioned earlier. But we see Jerome saying, I saw the passage in many manuscripts, both Greek and Latin. Now, for Jerome to say that they're ancient, I would take for granted that they are older than he is, for him to call a manuscript ancient. So if the manuscripts that Jerome saw were more than 10, then that's more ancient manuscripts with it than we have without it. So those and in my book, a fresh analysis of John 7:53 through 8:11, I go into detail about more early witnesses, more patristic writings, more versions that have a bearing on this question. I haven't covered the Palestinian Aramaic translation, but it has some interesting testimony. It is probably the earliest example, even though it's not Greek, but it is clearly based on Greek. It echoes Greek. It's an example of a text in which John 7:53 through 8:11 had been moved to the end of John. That's in the Palestinian Aramaic translation.
Yep. And I want to just make a comment. A person here, one of our friends, his name is Just Me. He's kind of puzzled, saying, sometimes, you see an event where Jesus is talking to Nicodemus or talking to the Pharisees or the Jews in general. Let's use John in this case. And somehow it jumps into another event. Folks, you need to understand, John is writing these events that took place. He's not necessarily putting them in an exact chronological order also, but he is reflecting back on those things. In fact, if you go to John 7 and 8 alone, you will see he is inserting commentaries there by the inspiration of the Spirit saying, Jesus said this because he has yet to be glorified. In other words, he's telling you, he said that back then because now we know he's glorified. We understand why he said what he said. So go ahead, brother. Any last thoughts?
Just to reinforce that basic theory that explains the whole loss of the passage in the early Alexandrian text and in some other branches that were influenced by it. Codex N, for instance, is an Alexandrian, but the text does have some influence from the Caesarean text, and so there is that aspect to consider as well. But early on, if you simply picture a copyist who in a setting where John 7:37 through 8:11 where John 7:53 through 8:11 was in the text of John, But in the Pentecost lection, the lection was supposed to move from the end of John 7:52 down to 8 verse 12, and there were these marks that indicated this is what you're supposed to do, jump from here to here. A copyist who misunderstood those marks that were intended for the lector, but who instead thought they referred to what he was supposed to do, that's a very uncomplicated explanation of the loss of the passage. And we can see later on in manuscripts like Codex Macedonianus, and again, in my book I have more details about this, but we can see Codex Macedonianus doesn't have the story of the woman caught in adultery, but it has clear signs that an ancestor of it did have the passage. So you can see how it's dropped out in that case. I would simply postulate that explains the entire picture.
Wonderful, brother. So I want to whet the people's appetite. I mentioned to you that it will be an honor really to have you back to talk about other topics. What other hot topics you think we can consider doing other shows on? So maybe you can whet the appetite for people here to hear you.
Well, it's often said that textual variants don't really have a great impact on doctrine, but when it comes to praxis, what is done, for instance, the question of fasting sometimes comes up. If a person's preparing for an exorcism, should the person fast? Well, if you have a text that says in Matthew, Jesus says this kind does not come out except by prayer and fasting, and a text of Mark that says this kind does not come out by prayer and fasting, you would naturally conclude, I think before we have an exorcism, we should all fast. And if you have that in your text, you say we have a precedent from Christ himself recommending, instructing us to fast. But if your text in Matthew doesn't have that verse, and if your text of Mark doesn't have the words "and fasting" in Mark 9:29, then you would not have that kind of precedent for what you would prepare to do. So that's one point where a textual variant makes a difference to the praxis, the policy of what is to be done. It doesn't make an intangible difference, but it makes a tangible difference.
So I like this. Let's plan on talking about this, and we'll all come fasting that day, and we'll benefit from that particular scripture. But go ahead, brother.
And there's some other passages where you can say, in the past there was a guideline for textual critics that said prefer the shorter reading. Well, a man named James Royce, just a second. James Royce did a little bit of research testing that guideline, and he concluded that the early copyists, if you look at the early papyri, that they tended to make more omissions than they made additions. In fact, they made about twice as many additions. And Royce concluded that you shouldn't really use length of a variant as a metric of whether it belongs there or not. That's simply not a good. That is a guideline that is guaranteed to not get you to the original text. Well, that's the guideline that Nestle, one of the editors of the Nestle Allen text, described as the first Nestle, described as a fundamental principle of textual criticism. Well, if that fundamental guideline is wrong, you should rewind and say, well, what should we use as the basis for the text then? And
can you?
Yeah.
Could you put the same book again in front of the camera, the one that you just mentioned right now?
Yes. This is Scribal Habits in Early Greek New Testament Papyri by James Royce.
If you can bring it a little bit, so people can see it as well. So thank you. That's a good source, of course, for people to go to. And you're right. I mean, sometimes you hear that the shorter is original and so on and so forth. And people need to really examine the whole issue. It's not just by rule of thumbs, if you wish.
Yeah. The canons of textual criticism should never be applied mechanically, and that's the only one that should be. So that principle of preferring the shorter reading, that was used to justify the omission of quite a few variants that are supported in the Byzantine text, but not in the Alexandrian text. Beginning not really beginning with, but especially since 1881, the Byzantine text has been quite thoroughly pushed to the side as far as what text is going to be followed for new versions, such as the it started with the revised version back in 1881, but also the revised standard version, the NIV, the New American Standard. Now, sometimes they will have the old Byzantine readings in the margin, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have this edition of the Bible has no footnotes. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, the newer versions like the NIV, the ESV, the Christian Standard Bible, these tend to be based on the Alexandrian text in the New Testament. Now, of course, this is not how a marketer would sell you the version. The marketer would say, this is based on an eclectic text where we've taken a broad, immense number of manuscripts and considered them all. We have this embarrassment of riches to consider. And we've taken that embarrassment of riches all into consideration when we compiled this text for you. But in real life, you can look at comments by this book here. Read what Kurt Allen says about that embarrassment of riches, and you will see him say straight up, 80% of the manuscripts, those Byzantine manuscripts, if they have the Byzantine text, they're irrelevant for textual criticism. He says that straight up in this book. So that's really the way that the text has been compiled. What should be done is a more equitable approach to the Byzantine text, to not assume, like Hort did, that it's a compilation itself that came along in the early 300s, but to recognize that the Byzantine text needs a place at the table, and instead of being set aside like it has been ever since the days of Hort. And I think that when that is done, and the preference for the shorter reading is not automatically assumed, I think you will see some more Byzantine variants being accepted into the text, and the folks that have. So there might be some folks saying, "See, I told you so," who have not left the Byzantine text from the start.
Very good. So I think we have our work cut out for us. We'll look at all of these topics. We'll do them one by one. In fact, somebody suggested also addressing 1 John 5:7, which is another interesting passage, of course. So, Lord willing, I have asked our brother here to consider coming back, not just one more time, but coming back regularly. And Lord willing, if he accepts his invitation, we will begin to explore those important topics. Textual criticism has always been fascinating to me. In fact, that's my PhD is focused on aspects of that, even though I'm focused on Quranic manuscripts. So with that said, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, brother, of course, for your wonderful time and for being here. And thank you for our moderators for the great job that you do. Thank you for our viewers. I appreciate your focus on the topic. Feel free to always reach out to me, leave comments. I know our brother James always keeps track of the comments and he corresponds with you typically. I've noticed that he does that. So make sure if you remember something, by all means do so. Check his own YouTube channel. And I believe, brother, you do sermons, I guess, online on Sundays?
Yes. I preach at a Curtisville Christian Church in Indiana. And if you go to CurtisvilleCC.com, you can find a button that will take you to the sermons. And you will also find a button that will take you to a large panel of text critical resources, including some that are categorized by verse.
Yep, wonderful. John, Betty, I already mentioned that we're going to address 1 John 5:7 also as one of those. Thank you so much for the reminder. All right, brother, thank you so much, everybody. God bless you. This is Al Fadi, over and out. Take care.